afternoon, everyone. Hope you're good. Hope you can hear me. 12:30 to 1 o'clock, Monday and Thursdays. And hopefully that's all working all right. It keeps threatening me with connection issues and things like that, which is annoying. I've got Jim in the chat saying phew, he's on the road and thought I'd forgotten today's show. I don't know why. I don't know what you're panicking over. When have I forgotten a show before? That's not happened. So I don't know what's up with him being paranoid. So yeah, you can be relieved. But yeah, do let me know. Points and prizes forever lets me know that this is working all okay and that you can hear me all right, loud and clear, Jim says, which is very good. So the annoying thing is that when I've been bringing the guest on last few shows, it then doesn't. I can't hear them, which has been annoying. And so if that happens, I will just refresh it. We've been able to sort it out. You've just got to be patient with me. That's all. Thank you for those that have sent all their feedback for the last couple of shows from last week, especially that one with Roger Kerry, but also with Natasha. So for those that haven't yet, if you are in private practice, then do consider joining the MSKPN and have a little look on their social media for links to our partnership information, as well as then contributions that we've had about the undergraduate curriculum change that's happening at the University of Nottingham, and that's provoked a really interesting public conversation, which is what Roger Kerry does best. So it was a pleasure to chat to him about that. Got lots of cogs turning. Now today I've got Jon Room on the show, and Jon, I met originally through the ATOCP. A number of years ago. I've followed his work since then. Just someone who's got a he's a really judicious academic and research-minded in how he applies that, but has always sort of grounded that and always admired him for being someone that really applies it thoroughly to MSK practice. And this is no different. I didn't know, and I'm looking forward to finding out that he'd lent himself to ACL. And studied that a little bit because I think that's something that to have someone like Jon on these problems is really useful. We had Tom Jacobs on the show a couple of weeks ago who really wet my whistle in this direction. Again, I haven't really thought about these sorts of problems for a while, and so I'm really pleased to have him and Jon and others thinking in this direction, and they will be presenting at Therapy Live in a couple of weeks' time to put some meat on the bones of what we'll talk about today. So hopefully in a couple of clicks, and as I say, if it cuts off, then if I have to refresh it, then be patient. But Jon, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Oh, here we go. This is what happened last time. So apparently, if it's anything like last time, you guys can hear Jon, you can hear me, everything should be working fine. But for me, he's frozen and it's stopped. So I'm just going to refresh it and hopefully I'll be back in a second. Right, now we're working.
Hello.
Hello. Jon, I can hear you now.
Can you hear,
Sorry about that.
Can you hear me? Great.
Nothing. Okay. How annoying. Right, anyway, we're on. We're here. Nice to be chatting to you today, mate. And I don't know if you just heard in my intro, it's like, that's my question is, how did you end up thinking in this direction? And perhaps you always have, and I'm just being rude, but I don't know. Maybe was I wrong to be surprised to see your name against that acronym of ACL? I don't know. But just how did that come about?
No, you're right to be surprised. It is a fairly new thing for me to be thinking about. And to be honest, in many ways, like I'm right at the beginning of thinking about the problem. Like a couple of weeks ago, Tom Jacobs came on and he outlined the problem, essentially the problem of adolescent ACL injury and a massive increase that we're seeing. And the problems that can cause. And I've ended up being kind of drawn into the idea of how or what can we do about it, or the solutions that seem to present themselves in research. How can those be implemented? That's a more interesting question to me. Like there's a problem, there's a solution. Well, how can we implement it? What needs to happen in ways of dissemination and implementation? So I have I'm part of the trustees of a charity called SKIP charity. Sporting Knee Injury Prevention Programs is what SKIP stands for, and you can find out all about SKIP charity at skipcharity.org. Tom Jacobs and myself are two physiotherapists that are part of the trustees alongside some knee surgeons and some sports and exercise medicine docs. And together we're trying to improve young players' welfare in grassroots sport through injury prevention. So it is a newish thing that I'm coming to, but I quite like implementation, or how do you take things from over here and put them into the real world, as it were. So that's what's drawn my interest. But I think you're right to be surprised. That's a fair thing.
Well, that would have been, it would have been amusing if you just like, I don't know what you're on about, Jack. I've always been studying this. This has been my world, and I just, I knew you just to go for a beer with or something and never paid enough attention. So I'm glad that it's not just me being ignorant, but it's good to have you thinking about this. I think you're right as well. That sort of, and it's not. I suppose one area where I'm not surprised is that it wouldn't surprise me that the spike in numbers and the sequelae of a problem like this would pique your interest, because it's quite significant. It's quite stark, as Tom laid out. But then also, it's not as if it remains a mad mystery. There are some that there are ways in which we could improve things that aren't necessarily being implemented as thoroughly as they'd like to be. So I'm not surprised that you're drawn to a problem that's an interesting one, but also feels solvable. There's something you can really get your teeth into there. So shall we just delve into that then? And Tom sort of hinted towards it. What can we do? And that's the title of this. So you just lay them out for me.
Yeah. So in terms of more broadly, what can we do? Well, there are solutions out there in terms of injury prevention programs. Whether you would describe that as like neuromuscular training, whether you would call it an injury prevention program, whether you would call it simply a proper warm-up, there are programs out there that exist and that have shown they've been shown to be effective. And so I'm sure that listeners will have heard of programs such as the FIFA 11 Plus or its predecessor, FIFA 11. There's Activate in rugby, and that comes in like various forms for different age groups. And then there's things like the PEP, which is mainly what we point people towards on our website on skipcharity.org. If you're interested in finding out a program that you can use in terms of warm up, the PEP is a great one, and it's laid out on that website. So there's videos of how to do it. There's full instructions. There's a bullet point, list of stuff to include. So like broadly, thinking about it broadly, there's stuff out there that we know works. We have evidence to suggest that that's the case. And so I think Tom may have mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, but there's a fairly recent systematic review of RCTs and cluster RCTs that look at injury prevention programs. It was done by Huang et al. It's in the American Journal of Sports Medicine, I think. And that just looked at high quality randomized control trials, trying to get over some of the problems of previous systematic reviews. And it showed that these injuries can be reduced by up to 53%. And it also suggested that interventions that made a difference tended to include plyometrics, strengthening, and agility exercises, in addition to giving feedback. So the coach, the physio, the trainer giving feedback on correct technique. So if those things were in the pot, the author suggested that's a good approach. And beyond that, there's quite a lot of variation in terms of what's out there, which might be of some comfort to physios, coaches, sports therapists, because if you include in the things within that broad framework, you've probably got some license as well. So you can fit in that framework, but you still got some workaround in there. And so we know that those programs can be effective. The main problem is probably implementation. In terms of how can people help, well, there might be many, many different ways to think about that. Because as a physio or a sports therapist, strength and conditioning coach, you're going to be interacting potentially with patients, with adolescents who have ACL injury. So you may be you may be meeting people before these injuries happen. So you've got a chance to influence that person. You may be meeting their parents. You may be the parent, right? Most coaches, most coaches I've ever had as an adolescent in sport were my mate's dad. So can we be influencing coaches and parents who may or may not be the same person? Can we be influencing other healthcare professionals? Can we be influencing those who make policy? So, some of us are at the level where we can think about influencing policy, and some of us not. But there's a whole chain of people that we can think about disseminating this information, or just saying, what are you doing in the way of injury prevention? What are you doing in the way of warm up? And so I think there's multiple layers to that. The evidence that is out there around implementation, and it's not huge amounts. There's a chap called Donaldson who is well worth reading if you're interested in implementation, and he's looked at it mainly from like a FIFA 11 plus approach. But a kind of his take after looking at all this thing, I think it may have been part of a PhD program. I'm not sure, but it was that a multi-strategy ecological approach is needed to increase uptake. And if ecological is a word that seems a bit weird or you haven't come across before, just think about the big picture. All the individuals that might be, all the individuals or all the organisations that might be involved and the context and the environments in which they work. There's probably lots of people and organisations that we need to influence, and I think physios can be really well placed to do that.
One of the things that Tom's chat with me got me reading and thinking about was when I got back into that literature a little bit, and I remembered it kind of harked back to an issue I had with it in a way, where they're conflating sort of correlation and causation for me to some degree. When they're describing it as a warm-up, some of the literature implies that there's no, they can't tease out whether or not this is a physical preparation from a warm-up where there's like an activation type exercises was this argument, or it was that happened to be a moment in time in which they train that individual. So on a physical preparation level, I can comprehend if you're getting someone to do some squats and lunges and the like, and sort of building up to a bounding based warm-up that is done on a 2 or 3 times a week or what have you, you can make sense of that on both a local tissue level as well as a wider neurological level in terms of skill acquisition. I can make sense of that. But then the literature seems to be also implying that doing it as a warm-up, like a gluten quad activation type argument, which I had moved away from, to be honest. And perhaps had I moved too far away from it. I wasn't reading this with any sneer. Like I could well have been that I moved too quickly away from it because there is a lot of nonsense in that direction, and maybe that I had thrown the baby out with the bathwater. So if I could just try and get your thoughts on that, because I know you will have teased those variables out yourself.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because it pains me to think of like me falling into that same direction of some of the nonsense that's out there. And also this type of thinking can lead us along that route of just like, everybody needs MOTs and checkups. And I really don't think that's the way physio should go at all. I know that some people do, but that's not what I'm thinking. I suppose in that regard, I've just come to it by looking at there's a massive problem that's happening. Adolescent ACL injury is increasing in big numbers, particularly in those that are sort of 15 to 18, 19, but also even in those that are 10 to 14. So these are young people that have significant problems. Surgery is complicated. Chance of re-rupture is massively higher than in adults. And then we've got this evidence that's saying, well, if you do this and this, it helps. And really, it's being led by that. And I sometimes manage to I suppose help myself over those initial problems by saying I don't care how it works in some ways. If I know that it works and it's stopping young people having those kind of injuries, I can get over the fact that I feel a little bit
Right.
uncomfortable
Well,
about some of the things that you described.
look, you
And
know me enough. You know me enough to know that I'm not going to let you get away with that just that quickly, though.
yeah,
Because this is where it matters.
yeah,
It matters if it turns out that there is a neuromuscular firing type, for want of a better term, where it's this the part of the preparation for an activity, then that is an appropriate time for it to be done. Not
yeah,
just because it's then going to be more obvious and measurable and then integrated into a session more easily, but it's also because that timing is relevant for their injury prevention within that game or training session. Whereas if that is a misnomer, and it turns out that it is just a conditioning based and potentially even if we tease out the muscular capacity, no, sorry, the physical capacity S&C piece with the skill piece, right? If it's one of those things more than the other, we can focus our attention to that, and it doesn't matter when. So that's
yeah.
why it to some degree would matter. Now, you may well have been going there, don't get me wrong, but I know you enough to know that you recognise that we can't just lump it all. I think you're saying that on a population level, God, let's just do it first. And I accept I'm not going to split hairs and spoilers being able to say just do it is better than nothing. But it will matter to some degree in terms of timing and amount, won't it?
Yeah, it will, and it will matter in terms of timing. And most programs are suggested that you do them. Well, there's a bit of a divide between like do them before training, and then do a smaller version before match day, versus do this 3 times a week, which is a slightly
Okay.
different
Okay.
ask of people. The other thing that's really interesting that I came across the other day is some work by a chap called Garrett Bullock, who has just got his DPhil from Oxford, and he was over getting his award, and I went and listened to one of his talks, and he's worth checking out because he looked at some stuff in America and the effect of COVID, because COVID forced this pause of sport at university level, at college level, and then he's found this massive increase as people have gone back to sport 6 months, 8 months, up to that point, like quite a big jump in injuries as to what would be expected from this sort of period of enforced stopping of play, and that makes me think, well, is there something there around readiness and conditioning, because COVID forced this period of not being able to play. And you also drew out some really interesting points around correlation and causation, and it's a really difficult area to draw those things out. So I suppose another thought of mine is that if correlation is if causation is difficult to find in any area, I just try and ask myself, well, what's the most logical explanation for what I'm seeing, or what best explains the results that's coming out of research, and that's what kind of draws me back to that. I'm seeing these programs and they have an effect. The review I mentioned earlier, and I said there's a lot of variation in beyond including plyometrics, strengthening, exercise, and agility. There's a bit of variation in what they contain, and so that adds to a bit of the confusion. We don't know exactly what should be in these things entirely. We don't know exactly how things should look. But from a population perspective, particularly in the UK, we're a bit behind other countries, and so I would say let's get cracking on getting the idea out there that warming up properly is an important thing, and then we can move forward in research and really look at what is actually happening here. What are the essential components that absolutely have to be included? How many times do people need to do them? When do people need to do them? But at the moment, I'd just say we're probably lagging behind a bit in the UK, behind some other nations, and we probably just need to get going. And that would be one of our I suppose desires as a Skip charity is to get people coming along to our website, going to the contact us page. We've got all the information up there about the PEP, and we also link to FIFA 11 and we link to Activates. But the most important page on our website is the contact us page, because we want people who are interested in saying, I want to think about this locally where I work or where I live.
Right.
And that, we've done work in Oxfordshire where you do a bit of training with some coach. You can do training with a handful of coaches, 12 coaches. Well, that can impact 400 kids within the next few weeks and months. Like, if you train the right people, it has big impact. But as great as Oxfordshire is, and obviously it's the best county going, but there are lots of people playing sport who are adolescents outside of Oxfordshire. We need to think about more than Oxfordshire, right? So we would love people who are interested in this, and we'll talk about this a bit more at Therapy Live, but to sign up and say, I'd be interested in being an ambassador where I live. I'd be interested in knowing how to train other people, whether that's training adolescents, in the warm-up phase itself, or whether it's training trainers, whether it's training coaches to sign up. So we have a bank of people across the country, and we can disseminate that a bit more. Oh, I can just see someone saying, obviously, I've never been to Devon. I've been to Devon lots. It's great. Second best county. But I've lost my train of thought now. Yeah, so we'd love for people to get in touch. And also, there's lots of other people out there that might have great ideas about, well, how can we improve dissemination and implementation. And you know what? If you've got a great idea, come and share it. Because if you crack this one, it's a big deal. If you can crack ACL injury prevention, things are going to go well for you in your career. So, send us any messages, get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from people.
Okay. I love that. I think that's a great shout, and I think that's where a lot of it's a self-selection thing, isn't it? There are a lot of physios that are also then parents, because that's a pretty common thing to be, but then also to be parent coaches or to be involved to some degree with their kids' clubs. And so it makes sense for us to be able to do that, and that you needn't feel alone. There are these resources as well as ways in which we can aggregate this data, and they can be confident in the likes of you, Tom, and colleagues to be able to look after that time and to make it channeled for an efficient cause. I think one of the things that I find interesting, because I definitely don't want to be sounding like I'm saying, well, let's just find out more before we get started with it, because there's definitely enough of a signal there for us to, like you said, do something. But I suppose it's more that, imagine, I dare to dream, right? Certainly, I'm not going to be so ambitious as to say, I've only just started to think in this direction, but certainly by next year's pre-season for your classic winter sports, in a way. By that I'm meaning the ones that do have a bit of a brief off season in the summertime. If you imagine that if we knew that it was a conditioning related and skill acquisition variable more than it was neuromuscular firing, then there's an awful lot that can be done in physical preparation terms in that pre-season when people might be thinking in that direction, and parents are often very persuadable on that. Like, how can we integrate it into multi-sport kids clubs? How might that, and you might be able to dose that a bit higher, because one of the downsides of it in a warm-up is that you wouldn't want to push it too hard, thus affecting performance and stamina into a game situation, less important in training. But that's kind of where definitely the more we know, the more we can be specific and targeted, but not at the expense of getting on with it now. I totally agree with that, mate. And I think that's absolutely true. And it's great that we've got that clean signposted over. So those that are just listening rather than watching, that is skipcharity.org. I think you said .org,
that's
yeah,
right, that's
and
right,
that's double P on Skip, and so please do make sure to visit that. What have people got to look forward to then for this Therapy Live work then, pal? Like, how are you going to walk us through it?
So at Therapy Live, there'll be Tom Jacobs, who is another physiotherapist, and he works a lot with this age group, and then he has a vested interest as well. He does a lot of work with the adolescent population, and he's going to be there. I'm going to be there, and then we'll have a sports and exercise medicine doc with us, Stefan Kluzak, and I think he's also speaking in the women's health stream as well. But so we're going to go for a sort of panel discussion to try and put a bit more meat on the bones of what is the problem exactly, what's the solution, and how can we implement that, i.e. what can you, the listener, the watcher, what can you do? So we'll go into a bit more detail on the day as to what we think you can do. But for now, I just say there is things we can do. There are things that we can implement, and yeah, you'll find more information about that at the website. I think what you said about physios also being parents, or like, you know, the look you get if you tell a PE teacher or you tell a coach that you're a physio, and they're like, oh, okay. Like you can have influence there. You can have influence. I've just seen a question come up. Does the ACL prevention program translate well across other lower limb injuries? So I'm
out of a job here, John. I usually read those questions. Thanks.
They're coming up on the screen.
Do carry on. Yeah, I'll just nip out. Go on.
Yes, I don't have lots of data to hand about, because I've come on to talk about ACL, so I fill my head with all the stats and figures about ACLs. But yeah, often these injury prevention programs are tested for more than just ACL injury, right? So, lateral ligament ankle sprains, for example, it might be something else that's looked at. They're effective at reducing overall injury. Obviously, I'm just talking about ACL at the moment, but there are good stats as well for just injury in general, lower limb. And obviously, if you're then moving towards other sports like or other programs like Activate, not just lower limb as well. That's thinking more from a rugby perspective. And I just think it's like it's moving on. So we're thinking about that preparation, whether it's part of training, whether it's as part of warm up, moving that forward. So we're just, I think you mentioned to Tom a couple of weeks ago that your warm up as a kid was like a couple of laps around and then like leathering the ball at the goalie. And I was like, that's better than my warm up, because it was just like leathering the ball at the goalie. There was no even a couple of laps.
We've got a cameo there from Jim, but I haven't got a headphone for him, so I'm not involving him. And it's nearly time to go. But yeah, so I was saying about the couple of laps around the pitch, lather the ball at the goalie. And then you're not the first to say that's better than most people, for sure. I think what's funny though, isn't it, about how different trends in like, I don't know, is warming up in or out of favor now? Like, I wouldn't necessarily know that. I don't know what the standard habits are, and I bet that massively varies from place to place. And also the vulnerability on the data. It's that you've certainly then got lower level, university level sport. You really are then, or your Sunday league type stuff. You're just in a really funny situation where still younger people, still with what we see as being statistically we know there's almost a vulnerability there based on age, that then are definitely underserving themselves and probably don't realise the dangers they're putting themselves into. And that's one of the things that's useful. Like, knowledge can be power on this. If we just help people to understand it, from parents to coaches to athletes themselves, it's just like, this is a really useful thing. Shin pads, it's a funny one because it really is. You wear shin pads, less so about reducing breaks as it is more about reducing bruises. But as a general rule, people, if they knew the data on this, it's something that would be the simplest thing that they would do for themselves. And if we can just get that out there, but in a way that doesn't necessarily scaremonger, leveraging that social proof that we have as physios. So instead of when we say we're physios, they then say, "Oh, bring your bucket and sponge," then they start to instead potentially be able to invite comment on what can be done for them that's different. Then I think that's a good in. I think it's a really good idea, and that now we don't need to be so vague, because I think I would have been before you and Tom are obviously waking us up to this. I think that I'd have been, you'd have been without resource to signpost to, and you'd have been out specific information to give them to say this is what you can do and this is why we need to do it ASAP, I'd have probably been too vague. And so this, I think, we'll be able to mobilise people more specifically using the charity's resources, but also for you to help us to understand how we can get involved as individual therapists and as groups of therapists and practices, because I think there's a network effect that can occur there as well in terms of the not just for prevention, but what local practices can do, and then also be known to that community for when, unfortunately, there's some that do get through and do end up having injuries, that we can get them back as soon as we can. And that's got a definite benefit to that area, both for prevention and then for treatment.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's about reducing risk. You can't eliminate risk entirely. Sport is fun, partly because there's risk involved. Like if you eliminate, like here I am talking to you, I might say something really stupid and then everyone will shout at me on Twitter. Like there's a risk, right, to doing most things. And you can't eliminate that risk entirely, but we can reduce that risk. I think we're well placed to do that. I agree with everything you just said there. And that phrase, mobilizing people, I think that's exactly it. It's about getting people mobilizing in the same direction, consistent message, disseminating, implementing where we can. Some of us will be implementers, some of us won't, but some of us will be coaches, some of us won't. Some of us will know the parent who is the coach, some of us might not, but at some level I think we'll all be seeing people that either are affected by or who can influence this problem. And I think it's taken all of those opportunities to influence the right people, to get that message out there and to implement what we know is best practice currently. Will it improve and evolve? I would imagine so.
We can refine it because there's going to be more data. We'll know better, but at the moment, there's certainly enough there for us to get stuck into it. And I feel like I say this, especially in your presence, is I can trust that when we do change things, you will measure it carefully and try to observe those signals. And that's one of the cool things about having someone like you across this, mate, is because we know that then it's not as if we're going to try and change something over time and measure it in certain circumstances without knowing. This will feed into as efficient a process as we can in an area that is important. So really appreciate you thinking in this direction. Glad it wasn't it wasn't just me that was surprised to see it, but it's really good to have you there. For those that haven't yet, it really is sort of last chance saloon. I think probably in 10 days it'll probably be sold out. therapylive.co.uk/tickets to get your tickets, and you'll hear more from Jon and colleagues there. There is also a session on the female patient stream by Jon's colleague who will be explaining a little bit more about the specific nature of that, like what do we truly understand about the factors that surround a female athlete that leaves them vulnerable to that, which will be a fascinating one as well. So please do get your tickets there. Thanks again for coming on, Jon. It's been brilliant to catch up. And where can people find out more about you on social media, for example?
At Jon Room, so JONROOM. Twitter is probably the social media I use the most. So you can find me on there, or just you can find my university profile on Google. Just searching for Jon Room.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it, and we'll speak soon, mate. Take care.
Speak soon. Bye.
Cheers.